In 1886 Arizona Territory, the sun had barely risen when two Apache sisters were brought into the dusty town of Red Hollow. Their hands were tied, their faces exhausted, and a crowd had gathered around them as if they were nothing more than property. The sisters, 22-year-old Naya and 20-year-old Leora, had been separated from their people during a violent raid and captured by men who saw their suffering as an opportunity for profit. They stood silently beneath the harsh morning light, refusing to lower their eyes. At the edge of the crowd sat 34-year-old rancher Caleb Mercer. He had ridden into town to purchase supplies, expecting an ordinary day. Instead, he found himself staring at a scene that made his stomach turn. The auctioneer spoke loudly about the sisters as though he were selling horses. Caleb had spent years living alone on a struggling ranch, but he had never believed a human being could be treated like an object. When the bidding began, he stayed quiet at first, watching the cruel men compete. Then a wealthy cattle owner raised the price and laughed. Another man made a joke about taking both sisters to work on his property. Caleb's jaw tightened. He knew he could not afford what was happening, but something inside him refused to let him walk away. He placed his entire savings on the table. The crowd fell silent. The auctioneer stared at him, asking if he truly meant to spend everything he owned. Caleb looked at the two sisters and answered that he did. The sisters were led toward him, still bound. Caleb immediately ordered the ropes removed. He told everyone that he had not bought people and that no one would be treated as property on his land. The words shocked the crowd. Naya watched him carefully, expecting another trap. Leora said nothing, but her eyes remained fixed on the rancher. Caleb told them they were free to leave whenever they wished. He only wanted to get them away from the men who had taken advantage of their helplessness. He brought them to his ranch, a weathered spread several miles beyond Red Hollow. It was not a grand place. The house needed repairs, the barn roof leaked, and the fields had suffered from drought. Still, Caleb gave the sisters the cleanest room in the house and left food, blankets, and water outside the door. He did not demand their trust. He understood that trust could not be ordered into existence. For several days, the sisters barely spoke. They watched Caleb from a distance as he repaired fences and cared for his horses. He never entered their room without permission. When Naya became sick from exhaustion, Caleb rode through the night to find a doctor. When Leora struggled with nightmares, he simply left a lamp burning near the hallway. Slowly, the fear in the sisters' faces began to fade. But freedom came with danger. The men who had sold the sisters were furious that Caleb had taken them away. They claimed the sisters were still their property and rode toward the ranch with weapons and legal papers meant to intimidate him. Caleb knew the law in the territory was complicated, and powerful men often twisted it to serve themselves. Yet he also knew that surrendering Naya and Leora would mean sending them back into the hands of those who had already harmed them. One evening, Caleb found the sisters standing beside the barn. Naya told him that they could not remain hidden forever. Leora added that if the men came, they would not allow Caleb to face them alone. Caleb tried to tell them that the danger was his responsibility, but Naya shook her head. She said he had risked everything for them, and they would not forget it. The next morning, armed riders appeared on the ridge. Caleb stood on the porch with his rifle lowered but ready. The men demanded that the sisters be handed over. Their leader claimed to possess documents proving ownership. Caleb replied that no paper could make a human being property. The argument quickly became tense, and the riders began moving forward. Then a distant sound rolled across the valley. More horses appeared on the horizon. A large group of Apache riders emerged from the desert, moving silently toward the ranch. At their front was an older leader who had been searching for Naya and Leora for months. The sisters stepped onto the porch, and the moment they saw him, their faces changed. The riders had come not to attack Caleb, but to find their family. The men who had threatened the ranch suddenly realized they were no longer facing one isolated rancher. Caleb had protected the sisters long enough for their people to find them. The Apache leader approached and spoke with Caleb through Naya, who explained everything that had happened. The leader then turned toward the armed men and made it clear that the sisters would never be taken again. The confrontation ended without bloodshed. The men retreated, knowing they had lost their advantage. Caleb watched them disappear into the distance, unsure what would happen next. He expected the Apache riders to take the sisters and leave. Instead, the leader offered Caleb a gesture of respect. Naya and Leora were free to return with their people. But before leaving, they told Caleb that he had given them something no one else had, a choice. They promised that their connection to him would not end at the ranch gate. Weeks later, Caleb's ranch faced a brutal attack by thieves who wanted his land and livestock. He stood alone near the fence line, believing the ranch was lost. Then, from the hills, Apache riders appeared. Naya and Leora were among them. They had returned. The sisters and their people helped defend the ranch, not because Caleb owned them, but because he had once risked everything to give them freedom. The attackers fled before the day was over. Afterward, Caleb realized the ranch was no longer truly his alone. It had become a place where people who had once been enemies could stand together. Naya and Leora eventually chose their own futures, and both remained close to the ranch and a man who had treated them as human beings when the world had not. Caleb had bid everything to take two strangers home. In the end, he discovered that the greatest thing he had purchased was not land, livestock, or wealth. He had earned trust, and in the dangerous American West, trust was worth more than gold.